Welcome back to Launch Window Research. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Lacoste, the founder and managing partner of Space.VC. This is a VC firm specifically invested in the space industry abroad. Jonathan's a whole lot luckier than we are. We only have a few publicly traded companies to choose from, but he's got a wide range of, I believe, 2,500 companies to potentially invest in. So, Jonathan, we're so lucky to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, Nathan. Excited to talk to everyone today.
Jonathan, you were a very successful entrepreneur before joining the space industry. You founded Jebit. So what drew you to the space industry? Was it a lifelong passion, or was it the recent industry trends that sort of drew you in?
Yeah, it was more recent. I mean, when you're an entrepreneur and you're building a company, you're pretty heads down in that industry. And Jebit was in the world of customer data, digital experiences, personalizing e-commerce. So it was not a space company. It was in B2B enterprise tech. But one of the things I reflected after building that company for 10 years, and we raised, almost $100 million and had a successful exit last year, was I wasn't always deeply passionate about the work. And I wanted to jump into an industry that I felt like, especially for your and my generation, I'm 28 years old today, could have a multi-generational impact. And so the question was, where do you want to focus that time and effort? And so space was always an intellectual passion and interest of mine, but I didn't really give myself the chance to deeply pursue it until about 2 years ago. And then I think what really drew me into the space industry was a couple of things. The first is that you always want to be helpful, right? You don't want to jump into an industry that you feel like your skill set or talents or like strengths aren't beneficial to where the industry's at. And so in space today, as you mentioned, there's over 2,000 private companies. The vast majority of those are started by first-time founders. We don't have a lot of repeat entrepreneurs in space. So as someone who has been through that startup journey before, especially with first-time founders, I'm able to maybe point out some of the early mistakes that we made at Jebit and help them build their companies, even if it's in very different industries. And then the other thing is a little bit more of a nuanced insight, and we'll get into it. But in space today, there's a lot of businesses that are software oriented or are based on data that's being collected from satellites. And there's a lot of analogies to be drawn from those types of business models to actually what happened at Jebit in the business that I was scaling. So for those reasons, I realized that my experience in company building as a founder was actually more relevant than I'd hoped. So that's what ultimately led me to jump in and invest in other startups and help those founders scale their companies.
You're right about there being a lot of first-time founders in the space industry right now. I think ever since the Falcon 1 successfully launched, that really proved that private citizens could be successful in space. And now we have had an explosion of 2,500 space companies. So with that many companies to choose from, how do you go about picking winners?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think anytime you look at companies, regardless of the technology, regardless of what industry it's in, you have to really think about what problem the company is solving. And is space the most efficient way to solve the problem that they're trying to approach? There's a lot of companies that might have a really cool piece of technology, and then they go and search for problems to solve. That's kind of the backwards way to do it. So regardless of what company you're building, whether it's in space or outside, you need to have a deep understanding of the customer's problem sets, whether it's an individual, government, or enterprise, and then to build a technology and a solution around that. So for us, one of the things that really differentiates early stage space companies, because we're investing at the earliest stages, two founders in a dorm room or with a presentation, or they both just left SpaceX and they have an idea. So we're investing at that stage all the way through. They might have, one satellite in space and a little bit of revenue. And so what's most important when you're investing in startups, broadly speaking, is the team and the people. Just like anything else, a startup is a collection of people. So you have to have a founder who can articulate the vision, has a really deep sense and understanding for the problem at hand and what they're trying to solve, has the technical or engineering skill sets, or has that talent around him or her to be able to execute against it. And then, of course, you want to understand a little bit about the actual product. How defensible is it? In space, it's really helpful to understand, does it have space heritage, right? Is this something that has been proven before, or is there inherent technology and engineering risk at play? What's the commercial or addressable market opportunity if they're able to successfully launch this satellite and collect this type of data set? How big of an opportunity is that? Is that only something that, one micro segment would buy, or does it disrupt lots of different industries? So those are all things that we do a lot of research on independent of individual companies. But then when we make investment decisions, those are important too.
Thanks. I have a few questions about the companies that you have picked so far. So one of your investments is SpaceForge, and space manufacturing is an industry that's a bit too early for us retail investors to invest in. But I'm curious what that looks like from the perspective of a VC. How big do you think the space manufacturing industry is going to be?
I think space manufacturing has the ability to be quite massive and disruptive. Now, I'll caveat that by saying it'll be a while before you have regular day-to-day items like manufactured in space, right? There has to be a economic benefit in a actual physical, like physics-based benefit to manufacturing something in space. And so what that looks like right now are really high-value items that not only cover the costs of the supply chain and launch to get something to space, but also the re-entry of it. And it has to be scarce on Earth too. So in the use case of Space Forge, their solution is aimed at actually the semiconductor industry. And I think we can all agree with the semiconductor chip shortage and some of the supply chain constraints we're seeing in the world around us, especially as we push towards electrification and electric vehicles. Semis are going to be increasingly important. And so what Space Forge has figured out, and it's actually based on 60-year-old research in the International Space Station, is that when you're 3D printing kind of a silicon wafer component that goes into a semiconductor chip, you can actually get the transistors to be much more closely mixed and put together on a wafer when it's in zero gravity compared to when it's on Earth. We've basically hit the limit of what's possible with the constraints of friction and gravity here on Earth. And so doing it in space is actually a much more powerful wafer that you can create. And so that's an example of something where there's a massive existing market, and it really comes down to their ability to execute it from a technological standpoint, but the market is there. And so they actually have their first launch this year. So we're very excited about that.
And I saw that you guys had a more recent acquisition. I think your latest one was Zona Space. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Zona Space was our most recent investment. Zona is an interesting one because it represents a theme we see in space that retail investors should be aware of. So for a long time, the government, the US government or other international governments, were the main builder and buyer of space technologies. But they're shifting from being, the producer to being the customer. And so the current GPS constellation that most of us use every day is actually based on 20 satellites that the government has built and managed and is currently a government service. So you may not realize when you're using Google or Apple Maps or Waze or Uber, candidly anything that leverages the GPS constellation and data set, that's actually a government managed entity. So the reason I share that is because Zona is building the world's first privatized GPS constellation. And in a world where autonomous vehicles, autonomous movement and mobility, location technology with the metaverse and AR and VR experiences, if you just think about the number of things where super accurate, reliable, encrypted location data is really important. There's not a short list of use cases there. So we are very excited to back Zona, and they just launched on SpaceX rideshares last month, their first mission.
So they're building basically a GPS constellation in low Earth orbit, and on their website it says they're going to be a whole lot more accurate than GPS. But that honestly seems like a bit of a nightmare to me, operating in low Earth orbit where the atmosphere is still a non-insignificant factor, especially when GPS needs to account for special and general relativity to even be relevant. So have you talked to the founders at all about how they're going to solve that problem, or is it a problem?
There's always challenges depending on where you operate in space, but the vast majority, almost 80%, maybe even 90% of satellites in space operate in LEO, low Earth orbit. Part of it is latency, right? You can just get information down to space much more quickly. Part of it is power and weight, cost as well. So yeah, a lot of constellations that are being built, whether it's for GNSS or PNT solutions, which is what GPS is broadly called, or whether it's other types of Earth observation, they deal and build their satellites purpose-built for low Earth orbit. But it's not too big of a concern. The bigger the concern is when you're trying to capture like optical imagery, photos from space, and you have a cloud in the way, or it's at night, and you need a certain type of sensor or optical solution to be able to see through clouds or in darkness. And so there are certain sensors and camera types that are better purpose-built for that.
Gotcha. Am I correct in assuming that in all the companies that you've invested in, you've had a direct relationship with the founders of the company?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, with the exception of SpaceX, obviously, just given the scale and stage that they're at, if that's your question. We've invested in SpaceX, I think 4 or 5 times. We continue to invest. Obviously, I launched this firm about 2 years ago, so most of our activity has been in that window. But yeah, we're really excited about what they're building, both from the Starlink standpoint and Starship. And we work closely with other folks on their team. But I'm not necessarily texting with Elon, if that's the question.
Of course. Well, the follow-up question is, What makes a good space founder based on your experience with the ones that you've met so far? What qualities do you look for in the founders of the companies you invest in?
I mean, 90% of it is going to be the same as what just makes a good founder in general, which is they have to have a certain tenacity and determination to be able to persist through difficult times of company building. I think a lot of the times people that don't have startup experience, it gets overly glamorized. And I can tell you that building a company is one of the hardest things that you'll have to do. And so people need the right mindset and determination and goals surrounding that. They also need to have the right vision and academic or engineering understanding of the problem at hand. They have to have a unique or creative approach to solving that problem. And so you have to make an evaluation of, do they have the skill sets to actually follow through on what they're saying? And no founder is going to cover every skill set, by the way. So you have to be extremely collaborative in being able to bring a group of people with different skill sets together, proving that you can recruit talented individuals that might even be smarter than you or better than you in other areas. Being a leader or a founder is not about being the smartest at the company. It's about being the right person to communicate the vision and keep everyone on track. But what I would say about space founders in particular, and one challenge that we look for there, is they have to have an even deeper understanding of their markets than other companies, because it's a much more difficult pivot for space companies than for software companies. So as an example, if you're building a crypto, blockchain enabled product or an e-commerce product, and you realize that maybe the approach is wrong and you want to shift who you're selling to or the positioning, you can do that with a few lines of code. You can spend 2 weeks working with your dev team, push out a new update to the website and go from there. But if you launch a satellite and it goes incorrectly, or you realize you're focused on the wrong market, that's tens of millions of dollars potentially down the drain and years of development that you have to pivot. And so the customer feedback cycles are just much longer in space. So you need to really understand your market that much better in advance before you begin building and launching a product.
So I know you touched on this sort of at the start of the interview, but sometimes VCs don't just contribute capital, they contribute experience. So to what extent do you interface directly with the companies that you are invested in, and to what extent are you able to share your experience?
All the time. I mean, that's my favorite part of the job, to be honest. I spend about more than half my time with our founders. As an example, this week, one of our CEOs was sleeping in my guest room here at my house, and we did a 2-day offsite where we went through every business unit of the company and put together a 24-month plan and really challenged each other on how we could improve and be even more efficient moving forward. Another CEO called this morning because he wanted feedback on a potential board of director candidate that he's interviewing. Was texting with a different CEO last night about a contract negotiation. So I think the thing is, when you're a founder, you're faced every day with hundreds of decisions. And so a lot of those for founders are first-time decisions too. So, I'm not, in our firm's not going to have the answer for every single one of those situations, but if you can just surround yourself with VCs that are genuinely willing to lean in and have expertise in a handful of those areas, anytime you're faced with an opportunity or a challenge, we act as good sounding boards and can help do the work and go to battle with you. So those are just some recent examples.
I'm not entirely sure you'll be able to answer this question because I know you're not really allowed to pick favorites, but which of your companies should we keep an eye on? Because as retail investors, we mostly focus on public companies, but which private one should we focus on or keep an eye on in the chance that they potentially do go public?
Yeah, we have a few companies that will definitely go public in our portfolio. I'll pick one, not because it's my favorite, but I think just from a education standpoint for your audience, it'll be good to discuss. So Loft Orbital is one of our businesses. They just raised $140 million from BlackRock, and they just signed a $150 million customer contract. So that's one of the things you'll notice about a lot of public space companies is they may have raised a lot of capital, but the customer dollars are lagging. And so a lot of the next cohort of great companies that we see emerging have really strong fundamentals and have strong customer contracts that are backstopping the valuations. So Loft Orbital is basically the Uber rideshare for space. So what I mean by that is a lot of companies, when they launch satellites, they have to buy, design, manufacture, launch an entire satellite dedicated just for that one company. But what if you could share that one satellite with 5 or 6 totally different companies with different objectives, different data they want to track, different cameras or sensors on board, but from the same satellite, the same orbit inclination? And that's what Loft Orbital does. So it basically allows enterprise non-space companies to outsource their space satellite efforts to Loft Orbital, who does the entire mission management and design process. And then they have software in a marketplace that allows customers to control and collect and leverage that data in unique and interesting ways. So it's a big theme for us because we think as space becomes more accessible, there need to be more companies that make it easier for non-space companies to launch and buy satellites. Not everyone is going to be an Amazon or an Apple where they launch their own dedicated constellation. There's going to be a lot of companies that just want some data from space, but want to rent and share that from a timeshare satellite. So I would keep an eye for locked orbital maybe in the next few years.
I know that, as a VC, you focus on more of the early stage companies, but are there any of the currently publicly traded space companies that you take a particular liking to?
I'll caveat that this is not investment advice, and that I spend the majority of my time in the early stage. So I'm not looking through the quarterly earnings of all of these public companies. But what I would say is that Rocket Lab is a really impressive company. I've had the chance to interact with a lot of the folks on that team. And, while I may think that there's going to be a lot of consolidation in launch and that a lot of the launch companies I would not invest in, I think Rocket Lab is an interesting company. And I think you see that when you go through their quarterly earnings, you'll see the diversification of like systems and manufacturing and vertical integration is actually 2 or 3 times more revenue than the actual launch business. So I think that's one to keep an eye on that might be interesting. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there with just that one.
Yeah, no, of course. So starting a Space.VC has definitely been a journey for you. What surprised you about that journey, or what did you learn that you might be able to share with, up and coming space investors?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. Well, I think despite the fact that I started and ran a company and, we had a pretty good outcome, there was still a learning curve for me in building a venture capital fund, regardless of what we were investing in, space or non-space. And so if you're just interested in investing in general and building a venture capital fund, it's definitely doable. But I would say one of the things to do is maybe just try and develop a track record even through your own public portfolio or making really small angel investments, right? And so a lot of people will start that way, even if it's with just a few $1,000s. And then, they might lead a syndicate where they raise an SPV with some friends or family and build a track record that way. And so I didn't have that because I was running a company. And so I got more questions than I expected on like, what's your investing track record? And I had to explain to them that I was a poor startup founder for a decade before we had our exit. And so, so anyways, that's just like general, if you want to become a VC tips. In terms of space, one of the things that I think space companies have to think through is maybe compared to other industries, there's so many more different skill sets required, right? You have to have someone uniquely skilled at selling into the federal government and some of the black box budgets that aren't on paper deep within the realms of the DoD or within some of the other adjacent industry, federal agencies. You have to have someone that's deeply skilled at manufacturing, whether it's a materials company or whether it's actually a satellite manufacturing company. You have to have someone who's skilled at different type of manufacturing, and so that can be quite difficult to recruit and train up. And then you have to have a lot of software talent these days in terms of being able to capture and understand how to actually create a beautiful software product for, downstream enterprise customers. So the only reason I share all of that is, compared to other businesses, you actually need a much more diverse set of individuals, employees, advisors, VCs around the table. So I always advise folks that are investing in space to try and surround themselves with folks with very different skill sets in the ecosystem, because space is very broad. And so just because someone was working at NASA does not mean they have the full purview of the space ecosystem, just like someone who might be working from space, but from the military aspect only has a certain perspective. So I would really try to, read and build a network across as many of those different subsectors within space as possible.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I personally have experienced in the short time that I've been running, not a VC, but just launch window research. There are definitely a lot of subsectors and a lot of different skill sets, and it really does take a full village to get to space and do meaningful stuff in space.
One prediction for you, by the way, Nathan, not to jump in, but I think one of the things we actually see in the early stage ecosystem and the types of companies that are space companies, I think you'll actually continue to see more of a blending of definitions of what is a space company. It's almost kind of like tech companies now. Like, obviously, they're still your public tech companies, but every company uses technology. And we see space starting to become a little bit of that back-end infrastructure data set that you may not even realize is a space company, right? Airlines are going to be leveraging space technology to provide Wi-Fi and location tracking and weather forecasting. New mobile app companies that use AR and VR experiences are going to leverage space technology as well for similar use cases. So I think you'll begin to see an emergence of a generation of space companies that might look and feel a little different than your typical rocket or satellite or missile, defense space company of the past. So just wanted to share that thought.
And everyone's going to be using space manufactured semiconductors, so everything's going to be a space company.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. So I have one final question for you. I'm sure a lot of the knowledge you've gained is from experience, but are there any resources that you used, any people you reached out to that you could potentially share with us so that we can, follow along your path and better ourselves as investors?
Yeah. To be honest, there's a lot of really good content out on Twitter, in publications like Payload Space, Space News. There are a couple of really good podcasts. The TerraWatch podcast is a great one. Space for Business is another great one. So what I would say is the best way that I learn is by speaking with people, and if I can't speak to people, just listening to interviews. And there's so much content out there on YouTube and through different podcasts. And what I find is the space community is still pretty insular in terms of like willingness to engage with people. So follow your favorite space CEOs or investors on Twitter, and you'd be surprised who you can get a response from. So I would recommend leaning into any of those avenues.
Amazing. Well, that sums up all the questions that I had. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing a bit of your knowledge. I'm sure a lot of people are really going to enjoy what you have to say.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on. Good luck, everyone.